Welcome to Beyond Distribution with GTDC. I'm Kavita May, and I am so proud to say that this marks our 50th episode. And to celebrate this very special occasion, we invited founding member of the GTDC, Steve Raymund, to be our guest today. Steve is retired chair and CEO of Tech Data, now known as TD SYNNEX. Steve talks to Frank about his personal experiences leading and reshaping the industry during his 35-year tenure, as well as his thoughts on the transformative nature of distribution, from the early pick, pack, and ship operations to modern day cloud and innovation incubators. Which investments, innovations, and trends had the greatest impact on the industry? How did the needs and abilities of the IT community shift since those early days of distribution? Get those answers in this episode of Beyond Distribution with GTDC. Check out the GTDC Knowledge Hub to access previous episodes of the podcast and other valued industry resources. Thanks for listening.
Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our next episode of Beyond Distribution. And today I am delighted to have for our 50th podcast a special guest. Steve Raymund is the former CEO and chairman of Tech Data. And Steve, it's great to have you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, you and I can probably end up speaking for quite some time about stories from back in the day. So we'll try to refrain too much from that. But I think it'll be good to start this discussion kind of at the beginning, in terms of your career in IT and certainly your career with distribution. Because they both come such a long way. But, when you joined Tech Data in 1981, describe the environment, if you could, from both an IT standpoint and a distribution standpoint.
Well, that was very early days. And in 81, actually, when I bought the company from my dad, we were a retail distributor of data supplies in Tampa Bay, generating maybe around between $1 million and $2 million a year. With 6 or 8, 10 employees, something like that. But over the ensuing year or two, we converted the model to wholesale distribution and began to acquire other product lines and expand our geography. And it was a pretty good model, easy to replicate, more or less, if you could get the execution right, which in distribution is all about, systems enablement. And, we stubbed our toe a couple of times to be sure along the way. But we were able to support all the extraordinary growth that we enjoyed during that period. But it was a hardware-centric business. Remember, this is pre-internet. Yep. And in the beginning, pre-local area network. You're talking about very simple standalone boxes that were sold, as you remember from your IBM days, Frank, that were sold kind of like a stripped-down automobile, and you had to, maybe with an engine, but you had to add the wheels and you had to add the fenders and other parts from third-party market suppliers. So it was all about putting together pieces of hardware to build a system that could run Lotus 1, 2, 3, or whatever the application of the day was.
Yeah. I remember, Steve, back in the mid to late 80s, when we started introducing the PCs, you guys were, and some of your counterparts were how we got to market. We weren't getting to market any other way, frankly.
Well, in those days, it was a little different structure, as you'll recall, with IBM selling through kind of badged medallions, that they even called a medallion, dealers who sourced from an aggregator or a franchisor like Computerland or Intelligent Electronics, versus a more free market approach exhibited by, say, a Tech Data or an Ingram at the time. We were blocked out of all those highbrow brands like IBM and Compaq and HP. But eventually, because the market commoditized somewhat, it didn't make sense to keep distribution closed. And, the market was evolving more towards integrators and solution providers, and IBM, Compaq, and the others needed broader distribution to reach all those. And that was really our moment to shine when we picked up these key product lines and kind of helped catapult us to the next level of growth.
Yeah. So along those lines, certainly during your time with Tech Data, both as CEO and chairman, both the industry and distribution has evolved significantly. But talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments, at Tech Data that you're most proud of.
Well, I was pretty proud when we went public in '87 after completing a year of 37 million in sales and 900,000 in profits. And we're actually without any help from private equity. I don't know if it existed back then, or venture capital. We went direct from being a family-owned company to a publicly held enterprise. And I think what I'm proud of is that I was able to last as long as I did in my seat as CEO and sort of quasi-founder for the next roughly 25 years, and kind of shepherding the company through thick and thin, a lot of different periods, from a little over $1 million in revenue to, by the time I retired, 20 billion in revenue, with operations spanning across Europe, North America, somewhat South America. I don't think during my day we had any real presence in Asia yet.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot to be proud of, and frankly, it's a great story, and it's a great legacy, and it's obviously continued.
I'll say one thing in my favor, that I had the good sense to realize when the business demands and scale were beginning. Probably I was late in this, starting to outstrip my experience and my capabilities, and that's when, with the board, we started recruiting an outside candidate to become CEO, and we were very fortunate to land Bob Dukowski, who for the next 10 years did an extraordinary job managing Tech Data to ever higher levels of achievement.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's certainly a lot of folks that recognize that over the years. Bob and I go back to the days at IBM when we were both chief of staffs for various executives at IBM.
Yeah.
He was the chief of staff for Gerstner when I was the chief of staff for the guy who ran the PC business at the time. So I got to know him a little bit, and absolutely just an extraordinary guy and great.
He was a terrific guy. What a great leader. Really visionary. He was a terrific athlete, and I think he brought a lot of that same aggression necessary to win in baseball or win in golf. He brought that to that game, to his role as CEO of Tech Data, and we were all the better for it.
Yeah. So, Steve, as you think about the evolution, and you and I were talking a little bit before we started this, about what we have seen from an evolution certainly with the industry, and also from a distribution standpoint. What do you think some of the most significant things are that's kind of happened over the years that you can think of that has really kind of changed the game a little bit?
Well, I suppose if you ask 5 of us that question, we're all going to come up with slightly different answers. But, in the beginning, it was a hardware piece and parts business. You kind of buy a chassis from IBM or Compaq, and then add a bunch of components to make it ready actually to function in a productive way. But it was really a hardware, it's pretty simple box shifting kind of model. Things began to change with the advent of local area networks and kind of work sharing inside companies. And then, the next big development, I think, probably was the internet. Because remember, when we started in this business, the internet was still probably 15 years away from becoming a factor. And then, by the end of the millennium, around 2000 or so, it was becoming a big deal in terms of driving revenue, changing the kind of products we sold, but also becoming a critical piece of everybody's marketing strategy. So that was really a crossroads or a milestone in the industry. After that, I would say the next big thing was probably cloud computing, and how distribution very successfully dealt with the consequences of cloud computing. Because on the surface of it, you have to wonder, how would distribution survive if endpoint products or notebooks and phones and everything is connecting into the cloud? What role does distribution have? But to the credit of the leaders across the industry, they figured out ways to morph and evolve their model to stay relevant and very, very profitable.
Yeah, it's funny, Steve. When I joined GTDC 5 years ago, 2019, there was a lot of that discussion that was happening, right? The discussion, exactly what you just said. What role is distribution going to play in the future as hardware, begins to diminish, the amount of hardware begins to diminish, cloud becomes more significant, and there was a lot of conversation about, again, the disintermediation of distribution. And so we did a study right at the beginning of 2019. We called it Distribution 2025. So we said, let's look out 5 years and let's see if we can kind of predict. And what we essentially concluded was that distribution had continually morphed and evolved since the days of, in the beginning, when it was sort of a bank and a warehouse, right? To us, back when I was at IBM, it was a bank and a warehouse, help us get to market, right? But that the history has been that continued investment and evolution. And then shortly thereafter, of course, we had the pandemic. And one of the things that happened during the pandemic was it became extraordinarily obvious to everybody how critical distribution was. Because I don't know if you remember, but until we got the component issues, supply chains in the IT space just kept going. Now, some of that was because of inventory. If you got 3, 4, 5 weeks of inventory, that kind of kept it going. But the conclusions we drew was that distribution was not going to be disintermediated, was going to continue to make investments in key areas. And I think we're seeing that, right? And I think that stems from what you started back in the day.
Well, I think along the way, there were many prognosticators predicting the end of distribution because we were going to be disintermediated by CompUSA,
Right.
retailers, and then we were going to be disintermediated by the big direct marketers, by CDW. But all those companies ultimately became customers
Right.
Of ours because our model is so extraordinary. I don't know if there's a more efficient business model in terms of the amount of product that we sell, the revenue we generate, and the margin that we have to live on in distribution is so narrow. But credit to all the guys. They figured out a way how to make money on 3, 4, 5% gross margins. And our margins in computer distribution are way. Everybody likes to talk about grocery stores as being the lowest margin business. I don't think so. I think computer distribution's got to be the lowest, which means the only way to survive is to automate, to scale up, get your costs down, which kind of reminds me of another trend that happened in the business, and that was globalization. Yeah. We became convinced that we were going to be less relevant, not so much to our customers, but to our vendors, if we couldn't support their global go-to-market requirements. And so we deliberately began to build out our global footprint, and it all worked out pretty well. It's not to say there aren't room for niche players, either geographic or product-wise, but the big distributors, Ingram, TD SYNNEX, are pretty darn dominant in the market today.
Yeah, totally. And again, that was one of the conclusions, was the ability to for 40 years drive at scale the processes that were required, in the space with little room for error, to your point, because of the margins, right? But with that said, one of the things, Steve, that we're seeing, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, is there are massive investments being made today in distribution to continue to evolve it. And so platforms, for example, are becoming, very significant. One of the things you mentioned was, who you competed with back then. One of the things over the last 4 or 5 years that a lot of people wanted to talk about were the hyperscalers, and how the hyperscalers who were competing with, distributors were going to, have a major impact on it. But what seems to be happening, exactly to your point, is they're now becoming more partners and customers of distribution versus just, competitors, right? But the platforms are helping that, and that's a big deal.
I'm on the board of 2 different companies, one called Wesco, that's an industrial distributor of electrical products, and the other called Jabil, that's a contract manufacturer. Both of us are neck deep in working with hyperscalers to build out their solutions. I mean, my view of hyperscaler is it's not like a zero-sum game. They're creating an ecosystem
Yep.
and an ecosystem that needs the support of an industry of different players to help them build and load their support their systems. And I know that, Jabil stock has been going through the roof in part because we have major relationships with key hyperscale customers, and to some degree the same thing with Wesco. I do believe there's opportunity for distribution and resellers to participate as well, and how they can help bring hyperscale solutions to market.
Yeah, it's playing out that way. I mean, that's exactly what's happening, and I think the value that distributors have traditionally provided, the hyperscalers are acknowledging that and recognizing that. I mean, one of the, and we talk to them all the time. In fact, by the way, most of the hyperscalers now have in place a channel organization with people that are responsible for distribution. No different than the rest of the vendor world, right?
I have to say, I'm surprised at how well and ably distribution has been able to adapt to an incredibly different model where it's easy to argue they would be disintermediated, but lo and behold, they've found a niche.
Well, a lot of it is multi-vendor solutions though, Steve, right? I mean,
Right.
nobody else is out there who can do what distribution does in terms of pulling together, 10, 12, different vendor products to drive a solution that is going to work, right? And that's, I think, a big part of it. And I think the folks in the industry acknowledge that and reference that.
Well, you're exactly right, and I think that explains why distribution continues to thrive in the era. I mean, hyperscaling it's raw computing power. It's a little like a electrical utility. It's great, but it has to plug into some other appliances that deliver solutions. And to the extent that distribution can help provide those compliances, can integrate them, can provide software and so forth, then they're going to actually complement what hyperscalers are doing instead of being disintermediated.
It's exactly right. And the other thing that the hyperscalers look for distribution to provide is access and coverage to the masses, right? Which has always been a value that Disty's provided, right? With your customer set, nobody could get to that amount of solution providers. And you mentioned the ecosystem. The ecosystem now is incredible. In the IT space, you've got solution providers, you've got integrators, you've got MSPs, you've got MSSPs, you got all these folks. And one of the things we've started doing at GTDC is we've started talking about distribution as the orchestrator of the ecosystem, right? Because just if you look at it, distribution's right in the middle. We got vendors upscale from us, right? And suppliers that rely on us. And then downstream, you've got all these folks that are in the ecosystem. And Disty's right in the middle of that. And that orchestration role is really becoming pretty significant and valuable.
And I'm guessing, or I think, because the solutions are complex. You don't just buy a piece of software off the shelf and plug it into AWS and you're ready to go. With your solution, it takes lots of different components, hardware, software, change management, and really the support of a solution provider who in turn is relying on the distributor to source their parts, and probably a lot of know-how and training at this point. So it's a team effort in order to actually make AWS or make Microsoft solutions viable and usable in the market.
Yeah, no question. And the other thing that's complicated it, frankly, is, since the pandemic, the amount of, folks that are working outside of the normal workplace has absolutely required the cybersecurity requirements to become much more significant. And the average individual can't do that, right? You got to rely on the experts to do that. And that's the role that distribution is supporting, right? And that's significant, right?
Cyber is one of those topics that every board of directors is concerned with. We spend a lot of time on the subject in both companies I'm still involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. So Steve, let me change gears for a little bit, and I want to ask a little bit about, because, I'm doing what I'm doing partly because you were part of the group that created GTDC back in the day. So when I look back, I think it was 1998, you were part of the formation of that, along with, I think, David, Dukes from Ingram and Roy Valley and folks like that. What was the thinking at the time behind GTDC? And what was the main mission back then, and the thought process?
I think the main idea was to promote distribution as a key partner in the overall supply chain. We were worried that they really forget who we are, what we do, and the value that we bring, or we're bringing to the vendors as well as to the resellers. So we thought that there was an opportunity for us to educate, inform, influence, if you will, the community, the whole computer community, to better understand what we were doing and support distribution. And I think we were pretty successful. Remember, a lot of these companies in the PC world see amazing turnover in their staff. They get a new channel distribution leader, they get a new marketing leader, and they require to education to understand how the ecosystem worked. And I think that's was a major role, is helping to keep all the different executives, both customers and suppliers, educated on the role and the value of distribution.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because it's been a lot of years, and essentially that's exactly what we still do. I mean, our part of our mission statement basically says we, educate, influence, and advocate. And a lot of people, to your point, have to consistently understand what distribution does. I can tell you, Steve, as you know, I spent a lot of years on the vendor side, IBM, for a long time. Then I went to Juniper Networks, and then I worked for Dell for a few years. And those are three good companies that believed in channels and believed in distribution. But within those companies, I would spend 20 to 30% of my time on a consistent basis talking about the role of distribution, why it was valuable, and why it wasn't just a cost, right? And to your point, we still need to do that,
Well, one of the things I learned early on is not only were our customers, our traditional customers, but so were our vendors in many respects. We were selling distribution services to the likes of IBM and Compaq and the rest of them, because they always had the alternative available of distributing themselves.
Yes.
Of course, those who tried found out it just cost too much money. They couldn't get the coverage. It just wasn't really working for them. So when we launched GTDC, it was really with this idea you articulate so well of educating and promoting distribution as an incredibly efficient, viable channel by which they could reach the market. And I think we were successful. I mean, you're still working, and
Yeah.
GTDC is still prospering. Distribution is still here. When we started, we would have conferences every year. We would get a small turnout, but over the years, the turnout really grew. And we could get CEOs of major suppliers coming because they needed to learn more about why distribution was important to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it certainly does make sense. It has made sense. And we're continuing on that track. And so that's a great story. Steve, you mentioned boards, and I know you're still active, in the space, and you mentioned Wesco and J-Bill. Talk a little bit about some of the things that you're seeing at that level, that, at the board level, that you think about and talk about as it relates to everything that's happened in distribution, between cybersecurity, between the proliferation of, AI, starting to become significant. What are some of those things that you're thinking about as a board member?
I think all of us are thinking about, depending on where we sit in the economy, many of the same things. Certainly cybersecurity and AI are top of mind.
Yeah.
Tariffs and international integration are big issues. I mean, Jabil manufactures products for 450 different customers around in 100 factories spread across the globe. So we have to pay a lot of attention to geopolitical developments, to economic developments, and so on. And Wesco has also got an international footprint, distributing electrical products everywhere, and a lot of them to large global enterprises. And so we have to be concerned about all the same kinds of things. I mean, just yesterday, for example, we finished up a board meeting at Jabil, and I was chatting with our VP of Investor Relations at Jabil, and he was telling me how they're using AI now, for example, to summarize the earnings reports from key competitors rather than having to read, the dialogue of each of each reporting company. He can have AI listen to their calls and then summarize everything for him very succinctly. He says, "You don't know how much time I'm saving with that."
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a pretty simple example, but it's going to have obviously everybody knows it's going to have a big impact, but it'll be interesting to see the way it's expressed across different disciplines.
Yeah, it really is. As I mentioned to you previously when we were talking, we spend a lot of time talking to IDC about their view of what's going to happen, in the marketplace. And what they've told us is we've clearly just scratched the surface. And part of the reason we're really at the beginning of the journey is because the data that's out there isn't really all yet AI ready. And so when that data really becomes sort of capable of leveraging all the power that AI can provide, then I think the game will really change. And today you see what you described, because we do the same thing, but our staff calls, we use a tool that summarizes it at the end and lays out the key points. And it does save us time, but that isn't anywhere near where ultimately I think it's going to go, right?
Oh yeah, I think there's a lot of one-off applications like you describe or I describe, but AI has, well, its future is to be kind of all present and pervasive, for better or worse.
Yeah.
But you can imagine any number of functions in distribution, for example, being automated through AI. I mean, one obvious answer is, in the call center business, how much longer are we going to really need humans to ask questions of and get support from? AI will probably do a better job.
Yeah. In fact, when we did last year in Europe, we had IDC present, and they showed use cases from call centers in a bunch of different industries, and they were the most obvious examples of where you were going to see that. And of course, now there's probably thousands more use cases, but that's kind of what they were showing last year, and it was really very impressive.
Yeah, it's fasten your seatbelt. Here we go.
Yeah, exactly. So winding down here, Steve, and one of the things that I always like to talk to uber successful people about is, over your career, what was some of the best pieces of advice that you got, right? I mean, what are some of the things that you could pass on to folks that would be interested?
Well, certainly in companies, it's in many respects all about the people and the culture, and promoting the right kind of culture, which in turn influences the behavior of people. So they're making choices every day in the field that are consistent with the company's values. It might sound a little cliche to say that, but when you find something that isn't consistent with that principle, it really stands out and you're kind of shocked.
Yeah.
Like for example, if I see an executive who clearly is self-serving instead of doing everything for the company first, expecting praise and so forth, I kind of recoil from that.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I remember listening, so you hear little nuggets every now and then that strike you and stay with you. I remember talking with one of the headhunters, actually. It was one, from Korn Ferry or Russ Reynolds, who was talking about successful traits in a CEO. They said, through all of our research, this is what we found that is the best indicator of potential success with a CEO. First of all, they're very curious. They ask a lot of questions. Secondly, they are very good at recognizing patterns. So they can see how all these pieces and parts connect and maybe where things are going. And one of the things I most admired about Bob Dukowski, my successor, is the third trait, and that's a bias towards action.
Yeah.
Right. So if you see there's an opportunity, you make a move. You don't just sit back and wait. And Bob was really great at that and all successful. I mean, Mark Mondello at Jabil or John Ingle at Wesco, these are hyper successful people because they exercise exactly these three traits very effectively.
That's really interesting. That's
Yeah.
great. That's great. Well, Steve, this has been fabulous. I really enjoyed the time talking to you. And as I said, and you I'm sure you hear it, but you really were part of the beginning of all of this. And here we are now talking about just within GTDC, almost $200 billion of product is being distributed around the globe from distributors that are part of GTDC, right? And so, you ought to feel not only very proud of your career, but also what you helped build as an industry. And so thank you for that.
Well, there clearly were hundreds of thousands of people involved, and it reflects the great leadership that we've seen in the industry over its lifetime. The fact that it still exists, it's still relevant, it's still thriving. I'm glad that it's good to see you again, Frank, after all these years.
Yeah,
you seem to be rocking and rolling, fighting a good fight still.
I am. I enjoy it. I mean, you and I are about the same age, and I have, I retired twice and got bored both times, and so I enjoy doing this. And you got to have passion too. And for me, I have passion. I really believe in it. From the days that I was a vendor executive, I believed in the model. I believed in distribution, and so now I'm passionate about what we do and how we do it, and trying to pass along that to other folks. So yeah, it's
Well, I don't know if you're going to have another incarnation after GTDC, but you've had an amazing career. Congratulations.
well, thank you, but there's a good chance I won't. Thanks again, Steve. We enjoyed it.